Hello there! Wow! Perfect! Wonderful! Well done!
Okay!
When you think of Nintendo, what character comes to mind? Of course, if you're like most people, the answer is Mario. However, there's one character that not only technically predates the iconic Italian plumber, at least in his current form, but is also entirely responsible for him ever coming into existence. Of course, I'm talking about Donkey Kong. To talk about Donkey Kong's history is, to some extent, the same as talking about the history of Nintendo itself, at least as a video game publisher. It all started in the late 1970s. Nintendo at this point was a Japanese toy and playing card company, but it had prospects of venturing into the arcade game industry and expanding into North American markets. By 1980, Nintendo had released a handful of clone arcade games that had proven to be somewhat successful, but they were looking to distribute an original game to really make a name for themselves. The game they came up with? You guessed it, Radar Scope. I bet you thought I was going to say Donkey Kong, but nope. If you've never heard of Radar Scope, it's probably because only about 1/3 of the game cabinets Nintendo produced for the game were ever sold. This massive commercial failure put Nintendo into financial panic mode. Radar Scope cabinets weren't exactly flying out of the warehouses, so Nintendo realized they needed to find a way to put a new game on those unsold cabinets. Enter Shigeru Miyamoto, an inexperienced Nintendo employee who had managed to impress the higher-ups in the organization with toy concepts he had presented. As far as game design goes, he had no prior experience, and yet now, Miyamoto was tasked with coming up with this fun, new game to essentially single-handedly save Nintendo. No pressure. Miyamoto's initial idea for this new game was to license characters from the popular Popeye cartoon, but Nintendo was unable to secure the rights. Miyamoto knew he wanted characters like Popeye as the hero, Olive Oil as the love interest, and Bluto as the bad guy. When the licensing for those characters fell through, the Bluto character in the game was changed from a brute of a man to a gorilla. The name Donkey Kong was chosen for the character, Donkey because the character was to be viewed as stubborn, and Kong because, well, he was a gorilla. Finally, in July of 1981, Shigeru Miyamoto's first masterpiece hit the market in the form of the Donkey Kong arcade cabinet. Along with DK himself, the game also introduced Jumpman, the playable character who would later become the inspiration for Mario. The game tasked Jumpman with scaling crooked support beams and dodging falling barrels in an attempt to save the damsel in distress, Pauline, from Donkey Kong's clutches. The Donkey Kong arcade game goes down in history as the first true platformer game. It also goes down in history as Nintendo's first major international success. Donkey Kong was the savior Nintendo needed, pulling it up from its financial crisis and establishing a name for the company in America. Pretty soon, the Donkey Kong arcade game expanded beyond just arcades. In 1982, Nintendo produced a special handheld Game & Watch device which featured a version of the Donkey Kong arcade game. Donkey Kong was also later licensed to Coleco, who ported it to their home consoles. Donkey Kong was crushing it, but just like King Kong clamoring on the side of the Empire State Building, Donkey Kong came under fire. In 1982, Universal City Studios filed a lawsuit against Nintendo and Coleco. Their claim was that Donkey Kong was not just inspired by, but was actually entirely based on the characters and events of King Kong. They ordered Nintendo and Coleco to cease and desist from further marketing and sales of Donkey Kong. Coleco agreed to pay Universal 3% of Donkey Kong's net sales. Universal agreed to these terms and forfeited their right to formally sue Coleco as long as these royalty payments were made. But the plot thickens. The King Kong name was already being licensed to Tiger Electronics for a handheld video game they produced. Universal reassessed their license with Tiger and decided it wasn't paying them enough. They also decided that King Kong was too similar to Donkey Kong for both game license deals to coexist. So they revoked their license deal with Tiger Electronics, who refused to go down without a fight. So why are we talking about Tiger Electronics? Well, Nintendo was initially inclined to do the same as Coleco and pony up between $5 to $7 million to Universal for Donkey Kong damages. But Nintendo instead decided to fight the claims, hiring an attorney named John Kirby to represent them in court. Nintendo reserved their claim that they had done nothing wrong. On June 29, 1982, Universal City Studios officially sued Nintendo. On June 30, 1982, literally the next day, the Donkey Kong Jr. arcade game was released in Japan and North America. Donkey Kong Jr. consisted of game mechanics and level designs originally created for the first Donkey Kong arcade game, but when they didn't quite fit in with the original, they became a sequel instead. The plot for this game was a bit different from the original as well, featuring a caged Donkey Kong trapped by Mario with only Donkey Kong Jr. to come to his rescue. While the original Donkey Kong game was created with the help of a third-party development company, Donkey Kong Jr. took that original code and reverse-engineered it, making it the first game developed entirely in-house for Nintendo. And because of this repurposing of the original source code, Nintendo found itself being sued again. This time by the third-party development company that wrote the code for the original Donkey Kong game. In the ongoing lawsuit between Nintendo and Universal, the First District Court found in favor of Nintendo, claiming that, at best, Donkey Kong is a parody of King Kong, nothing more. In 1983, the Donkey Kong 3 arcade game was released. This new installment to the Donkey Kong series shook up the gameplay and characters once again. This time around, instead of playing as Jumpman or DK Jr., players controlled Stanley the Exterminator from Greenhouse, a Game & Watch game from 1982. Donkey Kong 3 was the first shooter game in the franchise, with the premise that Stanley has to defend Donkey Kong from a swarm of bees. The game was received moderately well in Japan, but was a commercial failure in North America. That same year, however, Donkey Kong arrived in full force on Nintendo's first home console to hit North America, the Nintendo Entertainment System. The original Donkey Kong arcade game, Donkey Kong Jr., and a first for the franchise, an edutainment game called Donkey Kong Jr. Math, all released on the NES in 1983. As you might imagine, Donkey Kong Jr. Math wasn't received nearly as well as the other entries in the franchise, falling behind as Nintendo's only attempt at a Donkey Kong-centric edutainment game. Also in 1983, however, a sequel to the Game & Watch Donkey Kong game was released in the form of the Donkey Kong 2 Game & Watch game. 1983 was a big year for Donkey Kong, not only because of his various games launching, but also because it marked his television debut. Saturday Supercade began airing on CBS in September of 1983, featuring Donkey Kong and a number of other now classic arcade game characters, including, of course, Mario and Pauline. The show ran for 2 seasons, with a total of 26 episodes. But then, the Donkey Kong game franchise went dormant, as Nintendo decided instead to focus on developing Mario, who, as we all know, would go on to become the face of Nintendo, while Donkey Kong sat on the sideline, with many of his games still contested in both Japanese and American courts. Over the years of Donkey Kong's hiatus, his existing games would see a variety of ports and small spin-offs. Donkey Kong 3 arrived on the NES in 1984, and was also released the same year in a Game & Watch version. There were also a variety of other Donkey Kong-inspired Game & Watch games that launched in 1984, including Donkey Kong Circus and Donkey Kong Hockey. Back in court, Universal appealed the first verdict, citing surveys as evidence that they felt proved that many people associated Donkey Kong with King Kong, but didn't associate Donkey Kong with Universal, therefore establishing brand confusion. But in October 1984, the court upheld the original decision in Nintendo's favor. In 1985, after winning in court twice, Nintendo went on the offensive. Nintendo filed a counterclaim where they demanded that Universal pay damages for the cease and desist letters, as well as the legal fees and lost revenues that resulted from them. The court again found in favor of Nintendo, claiming that Universal didn't even actually have the rights to any visual image of King Kong from the classic 1933 film or its remake. They also ruled that the Tiger Electronics King Kong game was actually an infringement on Donkey Kong. At long last, the Universal v. Nintendo litigation came to a close. To thank attorney John Kirby for a job well done, Nintendo bought him a $30,000 sailboat named the Donkey Kong. They also cheekily granted him the exclusive worldwide rights to use the Donkey Kong name for sailboats. Of course, there's another character also named after John Kirby, but that is for another documentary. In 1989, Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. were re-released on the NES in a collection titled Donkey Kong Classics. The compilation cartridge toted the tagline, "Two great games in one game pack." Even with this, however, no new original Donkey Kong games were on the horizon. That same year, Nintendo rolled out its first true handheld console with interchangeable cartridges, the Game Boy. In 1990, the Tokyo High Court in Japan ruled against Nintendo in the lawsuit regarding the repurposed code used in Donkey Kong Jr. A settlement was reached after the court decision, and with the settlement came the official close to the Donkey Kong legal battles. The next year, in 1991, Nintendo rolled out its next home console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. But still, no new Donkey Kong games. In fact, it wasn't until 1994 that the world received a new entry in the Donkey Kong franchise. But at long last, Donkey Kong made his more than triumphant return 10 full years after the release of Donkey Kong 3. On June 14, 1994, a game titled simply Donkey Kong, but known now to most as Donkey Kong 94, released for the Game Boy handheld. The game was developed by Pax Softnica, and its gameplay was loosely based around the original Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. arcade games. Then later that same year, on November 21st, one of the most iconic Donkey Kong games in the franchise's history arrived on the SNES home console, Donkey Kong Country. The game was Nintendo's first collaboration with the now iconic game developer Rare. It was also one of the first ever games to use pre-rendered graphics, 3D models compressed into 2D sprites that could be run on the SNES. Rare was given complete creative freedom with the Donkey Kong IP, and they capitalized on this freedom with Donkey Kong Country by introducing a number of new characters, including Diddy Kong as the faithful sidekick and Kremlings as the game's antagonists. The game took roughly 18 months to develop, but the result was astonishing. It was praised for its groundbreaking graphics, and the sales reflected that. 9.3 million copies sold. Donkey Kong Country became the third best-selling SNES game of all time, and with that, Donkey Kong was back. Seeing the wild success of the first Donkey Kong Country game, Nintendo bought a large share of Rare stock, and greenlit the production of a sequel. Donkey Kong Fever was in full force, and Rare was going all in. They established multiple development teams so that they could work on multiple Donkey Kong projects at once. The next year, in June of 1995, Donkey Kong made his return to handheld consoles with Donkey Kong Land for the Game Boy, developed again by Rare. The game notably came on a banana yellow colored game cartridge and served as somewhat of a sequel to Donkey Kong Country from the SNES. Donkey Kong Land was another Donkey Kong hit, selling roughly 4 million copies. Then, later that year, in November of 1995, the true Donkey Kong Country sequel arrived on the SNES, Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy Kong's Quest, once again developed by Rare. The game was yet another Donkey Kong hit. Diddy Kong's Quest introduced more characters to the franchise, including Dixie Kong, Diddy Kong's girlfriend. The game followed Diddy on a quest to rescue Donkey Kong, featuring more challenging gameplay than the original. The game went on to become the 6th best-selling SNES game of all time. For the record, there was technically a Donkey Kong game being developed for the Virtual Boy console as well around this time, but the project was scrapped once the console was deemed a commercial failure. Only a tech demo for the game was ever completed. Then came 1996, an absolutely massive year for gaming and an absolutely massive year for Nintendo. Enter the Nintendo 64 home console, launching first in Japan and then in North America during the summer of 1996. Despite this new Nintendo hardware launching, Donkey Kong still had a few games left before he truly swung into the third dimension. In September of 1996, Donkey Kong Land 2 arrived on the Game Boy, again featuring a banana yellow game cartridge, and featuring Diddy and Dixie Kong as the playable characters, similar but not identical to its home console Donkey Kong Country counterpart. Then, in November of 1996, the Donkey Kong Country series made its final appearance on the SNES, in the form of Donkey Kong Country 3: Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. It served as the final game in the original Donkey Kong Country trilogy, and starred Dixie Kong as the playable character. The game saw Dixie tasked with rescuing Donkey and Diddy from a robot named Chaos. Dixie Kong's Double Trouble sold roughly 3.5 million copies, but being released at the end of the SNES's lifespan, it is believed to have been overshadowed by the almost simultaneous launch of the new N64 home console. The hype of Donkey Kong Country wasn't limited to just games though. Also in 1996, the Planet of Donkey Kong, which was a part live-action, part animated television block, began airing in France. It then went on to become its own full television series, called simply Donkey Kong Country. The Donkey Kong Country television series debuted first in France in 1997, and then hit North American televisions the following year on the Fox Kids network. While the Donkey Kong Country TV series might look a bit like nightmare fuel today, it was actually pretty far ahead of its time. Donkey Kong Country was the first animated television series to be animated using motion capture technology. The show ran for 2 seasons with a total of 40 episodes. Then, in October of 1997, Donkey Kong Land 3, the final game in the Donkey Kong Land trilogy, arrived on the Game Boy. Similar to its home console Donkey Kong Country counterpart, Donkey Kong Land 3 served as the final Donkey Kong game on its respective game console, the Game Boy. And just like its 2 Donkey Kong Land predecessors, Donkey Kong Land 3 released with a banana yellow game cartridge. At long last, it was time for the Donkey Kong franchise to race into the third dimension of gaming. In November of 1997, Diddy Kong Racing released on the Nintendo 64. The game, as the title suggests, was a racing game featuring Diddy Kong from the Donkey Kong franchise, but also introduced a number of new characters, some of which would later spin off into their own iconic games like Banjo and Conker. The rest were left to fade into obscurity forever. Over its lifespan, the game sold roughly 4.8 million copies. At the time of its release, Diddy Kong Racing even received the Guinness World Record for the fastest selling game, selling roughly 80,000 copies in its first month. That same year in 1997, Rare began development on its next true Donkey Kong title. It was originally intended to be another linear game, similar to the Donkey Kong Country series. However, Rare eventually became inspired by the success of their own 1998 open-world game Banjo-Kazooie, and decided to change the trajectory of this new Donkey Kong project. Finally, During the holiday season of 1999, this new DK game arrived. Donkey Kong 64, a fully 3D open-world platformer game, launched for the Nintendo 64 home console. In many ways, the game took inspiration from Super Mario 64, featuring similar moves like backflips and ground pounds. The game also saw, for the first time in the Donkey Kong franchise, 5 playable characters: Donkey, Diddy, Lanky, Tiny, and Chunky Kong. While the game was praised for being so expansive, it was actually so large that in order to play it, you had to use an N64 expansion pack. It was the first of only 2 games to actually require the console memory upgrade. While the N64 expansion pack was generally marketed as an option to improve the graphics of some games, Rare discovered a bug in Donkey Kong 64 during development that they couldn't seem to fix without the upgrade, so they were forced to bundle the expansion pack with each copy of the game. Donkey Kong 64 was also heavily criticized for the sheer amount of things you had to collect to complete the game, but even still, it was very positively received, selling roughly 5.2 million copies and becoming the best-selling game during the 1999 holiday season. And of course, we can't talk about Donkey Kong 64 without mentioning the now iconic DK rap that it used as its intro sequence. Nintendo and Rare were on a roll, and there was no stopping them now. Over the summer of 2001, during Nintendo's E3 press conference, 3 new Donkey Kong projects were announced. Donkey Kong Racing, which would release for the upcoming Nintendo GameCube home console, as well as Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers and Diddy Kong Pilot, which were both slated for the brand new Game Boy Advance handheld console. The future of the Donkey Kong franchise seemed certain. Until it wasn't. As development costs continued to rise, Nintendo was left to make the decision whether or not to purchase Rare, and they chose not to. In 2002, Rare was purchased by Microsoft instead, leaving Nintendo with the rights to the Donkey Kong franchise, but without the development team that made it truly iconic. Donkey Kong Racing for the Nintendo GameCube was cancelled. Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers was reworked by Rare into an unrelated Game Boy Advance game called It's Mr. Pants. Diddy Kong Pilot was similarly reworked into a Banjo spin-off game for the Game Boy Advance called Banjo Pilot. Over the next few years, the Donkey Kong franchise saw mostly ports and a handful of spin-off games. Beginning in 2003, the Donkey Kong Country games started arriving on the Game Boy Advance. In May of 2004, the first game in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series also arrived on the Game Boy Advance. The platformer puzzle game was a return to the iconic in-game rivalry between Mario and Donkey Kong, serving as a spiritual successor to the Donkey Kong 94 game from the original Game Boy. In June of 2004, the NES port of the Donkey Kong arcade game received a port of its own, classic NES series Donkey Kong, released for the Game Boy Advance. Finally, in September of 2004, Donkey Kong made his debut on the Nintendo GameCube home console in the form of a spin-off rhythm game, Donkey Konga. Donkey Konga was unique, not just because it broke away from the traditional gameplay of the Donkey Kong franchise, but also in that it used the DK Bongos peripheral instead of a traditional controller. The game was developed in collaboration with Namco, and, despite legendary Nintendo of America executive Reggie Fils-Aimé absolutely hating the game, it was released to positive sales and reviews. Then in 2005 came the arrival of Donkey Kong Jungle Beat on the GameCube. Releasing in March of 2005, Jungle Beat was the first Donkey Kong platformer since 1994 to not be developed by Rare, and it was noticeably different, but not necessarily in a bad way. The game was also compatible with the DK Bongos peripheral from Donkey Konga. It was also notably the first game developed by Nintendo EAD Tokyo, who would later go on to develop the classic Mario game, Super Mario Galaxy. Then in May of 2005, Donkey Konga 2 was released. This sequel was once again developed by Namco, and was the final Donkey Kong game to arrive on the GameCube, at least in North America. As was the case with every other Donkey Kong game on the GameCube, Donkey Konga 2, of course, utilized the DK Bongos peripheral for its gameplay. Then in September of 2005, DK King of Swing released for the Game Boy Advance handheld console. It was the first Donkey Kong game developed by Payon Corporation, and the final new Donkey Kong game to be released on the Game Boy Advance. I should also mention that Donkey Konga 3 was also released in 2005 for the GameCube, but only in Japan. Then, 2 years after the Nintendo DS handheld console launched, Donkey Kong made his first appearance in the form of a Mario vs. Donkey Kong sequel. Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2 March of the Minis launched first in North America on September 25, 2006. It's worth noting that March of the Minis actually marked the first reappearance of Pauline, Nintendo's original damsel in distress, since Donkey Kong 94 on the Game Boy. During the 2006 holiday season, Nintendo doubled down on its new generation of innovative game consoles. Alongside the already popular dual-screened, touch-screened Nintendo DS handheld, Nintendo rolled out the motion controller-helmed Nintendo Wii home console on November 19, 2006 in North America. The next year, Donkey Kong doubled down as well. In late 2007, the Nintendo DS received DK Jungle Climber as a sequel to the Game Boy Advance title DK King of Swing. It was once again developed by Payon Corporation, just as its predecessor was. Payon Corporation also developed another Donkey Kong game that launched essentially at the same time, but for the new Nintendo Wii home console. Donkey Kong Barrel Blast was a racing game that was originally intended to launch on the GameCube and utilize the DK Bongos peripheral one last time, but it was later shifted to become the first Donkey Kong game on the Wii. The game used the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, instead of the DK Bongos, to let the player accelerate and avoid obstacles. In 2009, Mario vs. Donkey Kong Minis March Again released as a DSiWare game. It was a follow-up to the Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2 March of the Minis game that released 3 years prior, and its gameplay was similar, if not a bit more simplified. The next year, in November of 2010, Donkey Kong doubled down again. This time with 2 new games launching in North America within a week of each other. On November 14, 2010, Mario vs. Donkey Kong Mini Land Mayhem released for the Nintendo DS as the 4th game in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series. Then, a week later on November 21st of 2010, Donkey Kong Country Returns, developed by Retro Studios, released on the Nintendo Wii. Donkey Kong Country Returns was the first game in the Donkey Kong Country series that didn't have Rare, the original developer, involved. In early 2011, Nintendo launched its next handheld console, the Nintendo 3DS. Then during the holiday season of 2012, Nintendo launched its next home console, the Nintendo Wii U. And of course, Donkey Kong would eventually arrive on both. In May of 2013, Mario and Donkey Kong Minis on the Move released for the Nintendo 3DS as a Nintendo eShop exclusive. That same month, Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D released for the 3DS as well. The game was a port from the Wii version, bringing in Monster Games to rework it alongside the original developers at Retro Studios. Being a home console game ported to a handheld, its quality had to be reduced to an extent in order to function properly on the less powerful hardware. There were also some other small tweaks made in this handheld version of the game though, including some item additions to make the game easier, as well as rerouting the original game's motion controls to the 3DS's buttons. Monster Games and Retro Studios then teamed up again. In February 2014, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze released on the Nintendo Wii U home console. As far as critical reception goes, Tropical Freeze on the Wii U was reviewed pretty favorably. However, as you could predict based on the lackluster sales of the Wii U console itself, the game sold a fraction of what its predecessor on the original Wii console had. Then in March of 2015, Mario vs. Donkey Kong Tipping Stars, released on both the Nintendo 3DS handheld and the Wii U home console. It was the first Nintendo-published game to support cross-platform purchase, meaning if you bought one console version of the game, you automatically received the other console version of the game as well. Tipping Stars was also the first 3DS game to support Miiverse stamps. But then, the Nintendo Switch hybrid home console launched in early 2017. With it came a wave of Wii U games being ported to the new, better-selling console. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze was, of course, among these ported titles, arriving on the Nintendo Switch in 2018, 4 years after its initial release. Its re-release on the Switch doubled the game's total sales and served as the final Donkey Kong game to be released to date. Through the years, Donkey Kong and his primate posse also made cameos in a number of other places, including all kinds of Mario games, Super Smash Bros. Games, and even a few movies. In 2007, a documentary film was produced titled The King of Kong, A Fistful of Quarters, which explored the competitive following of the original Donkey Kong arcade game. In 2015, Adam Sandler starred in a video game-centric comedy film called Pixels, which also featured the original Donkey Kong arcade game as the film's final boss fight. And of course, in 2023, the Super Mario Bros. Movie took the world by storm, amassing roughly $1.3 billion in the box office, and starring Seth Rogen as the voice of Donkey Kong. I'd also be remiss if I didn't note that the wildly successful Super Mario Bros. Movie from 2023 was produced by Illumination Animation and distributed by, ironically, Universal Pictures. At the end of the day, who knows? In another reality, perhaps Universal never legally assaulted Nintendo over the rights to Donkey Kong. Perhaps in this same reality, the Donkey Kong game franchise never stalled. Perhaps Mario would have never come to be Nintendo's mascot, and instead a big stubborn ape would be running the show. In another reality yet, perhaps Nintendo did in fact purchase Rare before Microsoft got the chance. Perhaps in this reality, the incredibly popular Donkey Kong Country series would be left to continue with the original developers at the helms. And perhaps we would have even seen a follow-up to the expansive Donkey Kong 64, maybe even incorporating more of the now long-forgotten Diddy Kong Racing cast. There are so many twists and turns in the incredible history of Donkey Kong that it's impossible to trace them all to see how things could have been. So we'll focus instead on what we know to be. If not for Donkey Kong, there would be no Mario, and certainly no Super Mario Bros. If not for Donkey Kong back in 1981, there almost certainly wouldn't even be Nintendo today. So when you think of Nintendo, of course Mario will always come to mind. But when it really comes down to it, Nintendo would be nothing without the King of Swing, the Banana Slamma, the ape behind the jungle japes, Donkey Kong.